Hey everyone, I'm looking to lose some subscribers, so that must mean it's time for a book video. At this point, I would like to insert some confetti and some fanfare, trumpets. Now, this is going to cover all the books I've read, finished so far this year. One I did start later last year, but it's a really good book, and I did not talk about it last year since I wasn't done, so it's being tossed in here. Now, there are two I don't have books to show, so one of which was an ebook, and that was Rome, Parthia, and India, The Violent Emergence of a New World Order, 150 to 140 BC by John Granger. John Granger is one of the most well-known general authors and historians about the Seleucid Empire. And that's what this book is about. Despite the title, it's actually about the fall of the Seleucid Empire and how that drew in everyone around them. Been a while since I read it, but a quick summary is that by 138 BC, so a little over 10 years, like 12 years, you went from Macedon being four republics to being annexed by Rome, portions of, or all of Greece annexed by Rome, portions of North Africa annexed by Rome, the Near East annexed by Rome. And essentially what happened was, as the Seleucid Empire crumbled, Parthia emerged, Bactria broke away as it went after holdings in India, and then it began to fall. You had Judea, its armies gained land for a while. You essentially centered on a pretender to the throne was successful, and by the end, Seleucid Empire was essentially a rump state in Syria. That inspired a pretender in Macedonia, which caused Rome to annex it. That drew in Greece, causing Rome to annex it, and so on. It's a snowball effect. Because it spans so much, it's spread a little too thin at times, but it's an interesting book. He ties it all together pretty well. So if you're just interested in one of the most important decades of history, I would recommend it. It is a general history, so it's made for the general reader in mind. That said, it's a pen and sword book, so the editing is rough as always. I really wish they'd look into that, but that's kind of the sacrifice you make for those. The other one is, I looked up how to pronounce her last name, but it didn't sound right. It's Marguerite Yourcenar. She wrote one of my favorite books, The Abyss. She also wrote Memoirs of Hadrian. This book is called Oriental Tales. I didn't get a lot out of this book, and that's why I donated it, because I wasn't familiar with the folk tale she was talking about. Now, it's a really interesting approach. So she basically took some Chinese, some Japanese, but mostly Central and Eastern European folk tales and wrote about them from a different perspective. So say the main character meets five people, well, she would pick the third person, give that person a backstory and how they came to meet the main character. Now, if you knew the original folk tale, that would be really interesting and open up kind of like a whole new way to think about the story. But to me, who didn't know about it, it's just in the end, this person meets someone else and it kind of ends. So I'm going, well, what's the point of that story? But no, if I had known the original, I would have thought, oh, that's how it ties together. So if you're well versed in folk tales, especially Central and Eastern European, definitely give it a shot. I don't know why it's called Oriental Tales, because most of them are not, or most of them are from Europe. I think it's because she wrote one original one that was based in China. And it's actually pretty good. It's the first story. It's about a painter. And you can actually find that on YouTube. Someone made a cartoon animating it. Now on to the books I have physical copies of. Empress Zenobia, Palmyra's Rebel Queen. Palmyra in the news because of ISIS. And they pretty much destroyed the ruins that were left of what was a once thriving mercantile-based oasis. Palmyra was founded on an oasis along a trade route. This book kind of stresses that it wasn't really a general trade route for everyone else, but for Palmyrans. And they got preference in terms of leasing and renting, because you would have to rent space out, rent wagons, pack mules or camels, any sort of system of transportation, whether that's animal, boat. They made deals with ports in Egypt and elsewhere, and essentially focuses on whenever she takes over, she begins to assert her authority, which causes the Emperor Aurelian to come down and defeat her twice. So the book kind of covers, her brief history, the history of the city, how the city made its money, why it was so important, um, how there's a famous siege of Palmyra, but archaeological evidence says it wasn't much of a siege because they didn't have town walls really. They had a system, but it didn't completely encircle the town. It was more to deter raiding. Although the only odd thing is, uh, and the author's Pat Southern. She has a really good book on several really good books on late Roman armies. She mentions how basically Aurelian being something of a bully, which is weird because she mentions that right after a section on Zenobia basically overriding whatever authority she might have inherited from her husband, who was bestowed a consulship because he helped defend the eastern frontier. And then she basically just overthrew governors and invaded Egypt. I think at that point, what's going to happen. They're not going to let that slide. She says that maybe Aurelian or one of the previous emperors had a deal with her, but all that's speculation. What is known is that she invaded. Apparently, some of the governors did side with her and some of the troops, but Aurelian came down and kind of squashed that. It's another general history, not bad. Because not a lot is known about her, and this has happened in other books, you get these extended sequences on like Zenobia throughout pop culture, and she talks about all the operas and plays that Zenobia is a subject of, which I could have really done without. I read it and it was all right. I didn't need to know it in the end, but when I was done, I realized that it didn't add much. Just that she had a great impact, much more of an impact up until the late 1800s, early 1900s. But if you're interested on her, there's not much really. So this is one of the few resources out there dedicated solely to Zenobia, and she is an interesting character, or person, I should say. Character in terms of like historical personality. Really went for it, didn't work out in the end, but you know what? She tried. And give this a look if you have any interest in her. Like I said, not much else on her, but Pat Southern's a good author. Let's see here. Dun-dun. Two of these are related, so I'm going to Oh, let's see. I did not grab all of them. I will grab it after I talk about this next one, which is going to be Slaves, Warfare, and Ideology in the Greek Histories. I did not know that slaves serving in Greek armies was controversial. I guess it was for a while, but now it's kind of not, it seems. This book is early 2000s. Early to mid 2000s. And yeah, in a lot of the histories, they flat out say that, there were slave rowers, there were slave infantry, and for some reason, historians kind of went, used some mental gymnastics to get around that. And the author, Peter Hunt, is basically saying, why are you doing that? They tell you that, Then he tries to figure out, using calculations we have on how many people it took to man a boat, in regards to how many slaves there were, because a lot of the city-states did keep really good records for their citizens, because citizens would get rights, especially in Athens. Athens' citizenship was prized, so we still have a lot of their records. So he figures out if a city-state had X amount of citizens, of those, how many would be fit for rowing, how many boats did they have, how many rowers would that take, and he figured out that some places had over half of their navy was comprised of slaves. So the beginning is really him debating other historians, which that part did drag. I'm not familiar with many of the arguments presented because the books were from the 70s and 80s, some 90s, but mostly 70s and 80s. I guess if you're well versed in this, you know what he's talking about. But because I just took him to be right from the beginning, I didn't need much convincing. But once you get past that, you get to some really good stuff. How Thucydides would actually ignore the role of slavery. And it goes into the whole dichotomy between what does it mean to be a citizen but a slave soldier, because to be a citizen was to defend the state, but if a slave could defend the state, then that really negates that person's or citizen's argument in having a say in politics, especially because there were many elites who didn't think there was much of a difference between slaves and the lower class. And there's a healthy bit on Xenophon and Herodotus, especially Xenophon, who was really big on the military elite being the ruling class, so therefore slaves couldn't be in the military, but he was also very pragmatic, and he had slaves in his army during the March of the 10,000, And in another work, kind of goes into detail about why you should arm slaves, and it's not a big deal. So yeah, you can pretty much skip the beginning of the book and just head straight to second or third chapter in. It's not too long. A lot of this is just reference material. But starting about chapter 2 or 3 on, you're going to get to the meat of it. The previous stuff, where he debates other professors' thoughts. You get some interesting bits in there, but I'm talking maybe one sentence out of a paragraph. The rest is him debating, their stances. And in the remaining of the book, he does do it off and on, but a lot of it is relegated to the footnotes. So if you want to hit that when you're done, circle on back to it. But definitely check out the sections on Xenophon. That is the best bit. Herodotus and Thucydides also good, but the pieces on Xenophon are really good. These next three are related, so let me go ahead and grab the books that I missed real quick. Back. Now, hopefully that was seamless. I don't think it will be because the air conditioning is on. But I did find the other books, so let's go. This is The Gods of Battle, The Thracians at War. This book really benefits from being the only book I know of dedicated solely to the Thracians. They became a very popular, group to hire mercenaries for, Peltus especially. This book talks about Peltus quite a bit. The book talks about a lot quite a bit, and that can be where it's negative. The author does become repetitive at times. And he gives you a lot of detail, such as the height and width of some fortifications' walls. And a few times that's okay, but after the third or fourth set, you just want to get to the meat and potatoes, I'll say. A lot of stuff that should have been relegated to footnotes is discussed in the paragraph, and kind of like in a stream of conscious way. It's like reading out his thoughts. This did come from a website, so I guess that might be what it is. He's pulling kind of blog articles and editing them together. Now, he does go to conferences and stuff, and he has researched it quite a bit. So when I say blog, I'm not trying to disparage it and say it's just kind of, written offhand. But they do come across that it was, the pieces were cribbed together. And you'll see that in some other books I have where you can tell they were written at different times. And instead of kind of doing a holistic editing of the work, it's kind of piece by piece. And so when you put it together, piece by piece, it reads fine. But as a body of work, it does become repetitive and it drags. But like I said, this is the only book in English dedicated to the Thracians. And it covers everything from what they wore, how they were portrayed in, I'll say media, for lack of a better word, in terms of like art, paintings, tomb paintings, things like that. How they worshipped, who they were aligned with. But basically they were seen as this kind of chaotic swarm by the Greeks because it said over 1 million of them. They were the most populous people. They didn't have a central, they did have some houses that came to prominence, but nothing like in other parts of Europe. There was no like one overarching king or emperor that was able to gather them all together for a sustained period of time. Instead, there were just a bunch of tribes, like I said, often hired out as mercenaries. So you might be aligned with 3 tribes in an area. You try to go somewhere, but the other 4 ambush you. So they were just seen as this chaotic swarm. They would fall on Greek settlements, destroy them, or align with them. And without, central authorities to deal with, no one really knew how to deal with them. So he does a good job explaining all of that. But again, you'll just have to sit through some repetitive bits, as you have with my videos. Next up, and that kind of folds onto this one here, Rome and the Western Greeks, 350 BC to AD 200. This is essentially about southern Italy. How it was Magna, Graecia. And I was surprised to learn a few things, how Greek was prominent up to like 200 AD in many of the cities. A lot of them still had laws in Greek, despite the fact that, Latin was very prominent. But this was written as, I believe, a dissertation turned into a book, and you can really tell, because as with the Thracian one, there are several bits that are repeated, like almost verbatim, in an odd way. So the author won't tell you what a title is of a town council, say. She'll mention it, throughout the book. You'll never get a good definition of what it is. Other times, it'll be In the last quarter of the book, she finally tells you what it is. But then you'll get like the tablets of, I think it's the tablets of Heraclea. She says what they are like 5 times. And in one instance, she says the exact same thing on the next page. It's almost a full paragraph. You turn the page and she does it again. So it really hasn't been cleaned up very well. But again, that's what you have when you crib together various articles. It's interesting to learn just how long the Greek influence lasted. It really was until going into late antiquity. Talks about the economy, the culture, how it was a little different, how rich Latins like to go visit, and they kind of spread their influence that way in their like holiday villas. Very niche, I'm not going to lie, but it was interesting. And goes on. It does talk about, like I said, the town councils, the different forms of governance. And what's really nice of when it goes towards 350, you learn about during the social wars, how they played a part, how central and northern Italian tribes and peoples interacted with them. So niche but interesting and repetitive.